The Spartan army stood at the center of the Spartan state, whose male and female citizens were trained in the discipline and honor of the warrior society. Subjects to military drill from early manhood, the Spartans were one of the most feared military forces in the Greek world. At the height of Sparta's power, between the 6th and 4th centuries BC, it was commonly accepted that one Spartan was worth several men of any other state. According to Thucydides, the famous moment of Spartan surrender on the island of Sphacteria, off Pylos, was highly unexpected. He said that it was the common perception at the time that Spartans would never lay down their weapons for any reason, be it hunger or danger. The iconic army was first developed by the semi-mythical Spartan legislator Lycurgus, referring to Sparta having a wall of men instead of bricks. He proposed to reform Spartan society to create a military-focused lifestyle in accordance with proper virtues, such as equality for the male citizens, austerity, strength, and fitness. A Spartan man's involvement with the army began in infancy when he was inspected by the Gerousia. If the baby was found to be weak or deformed, he was left at Mount Taygetus to die. Since the world of the Spartans was no place for those who could not fend for themselves, it should be noted, however, that the practice of discarding children at birth took place in Athens as well. Those deemed strong were then put in the Agadi regime at the age of 7. Under the Agadi, the young boys or Spartiates were kept under intense and rigorous military training. Their education focused primarily on cunning, sports and war tactics, but also included poetry, music, academics, and sometimes politics. Those who passed the Agadi by the age of 30 were given full Spartan citizenship. The term Spartan became synonymous with fearlessness, harsh and cruel life, endurance, or simplicity by design. Mycenaean Age. The first reference to the Spartans at war is in the Iliad, in which they featured among the other Greek contingents. Like the rest of the Mycenaean-era armies, it was depicted as composed largely of infantry, equipped with short swords, spears, and dipylon-type and simple round bronze shields. This was an age of heroic warfare with simple tactics, often little more than a general charge and a great deal of killing. It was common for entire armies to be chased down and killed after a rout. The basic tactic of battle was free-for-all. War chariots were used by the elite, but unlike their counterparts in the Middle East, they appear to have been used for transport, with the warrior dismounting to fight on foot and then remounting to withdraw from combat. Although some accounts show warriors throwing their spear from the chariot before dismounting. Archaic Age and expansion. Mycenaean Sparta, like much of Greece, was engulfed in the Dorian invasions, which ended the Mycenaean civilization and ushered in the so-called Greek Dark Ages. During this time, Sparta was merely a Doric village on the banks of the river Eurotas in Laconia. However, in the early 8th century BC, Spartan society was transformed. The reforms, which were ascribed by later tradition to the possibly mythical figure of Lycurgus, created new institutions and established the military nature of the Spartan state. This constitution of Lycurgus remained essentially unchanged for 5 centuries. From California, 750 BC, Sparta embarked on a steady expansion, first by subduing Amyclae and the other settlements of Laconia, and later, in the First Messenian War, conquering the fertile country of Messenia. By the beginning of the 7th century BC, Sparta was, along with Argos, the dominant power in the Peloponnese. Establishment of Spartan hegemony over the Peloponnese. Inevitably, these two powers collided. Initial Argive successes, such as the victory at the Battle of Hyshai in 669 BC, led to an uprising of the Messenians, which tied down the Spartan army for almost 20 years. Over the course of the 6th century, Sparta secured her control of the Peloponnese Peninsula. Arcadia was forced to recognize Spartan overlordship. Argos lost Sinuria in about 546 and suffered a further crippling blow from Cleomenes Iotha. Battle of Sepaea in 494. While repeated expeditions against tyrannical regimes throughout Greece greatly raised their prestige, by the early 5th century, Sparta was the unchallenged master in southern Greece. As the leading power of the newly established Peloponnesian League, Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. By the late 6th century BC, Sparta was recognized as the preeminent Greek city-state. King Croesus of Lydia established an alliance with the Spartans, and later, the Greek cities of Asia Minor appealed to them for help during the Ionian Revolt. In the Second Persian invasion of Greece, under Xerxes, Sparta was assigned the overall leadership of Greek forces on land and at sea. The Spartans played a crucial role in the repulsion of the invasion, notably at the battles of Thermopylae and Plataea. In the aftermath, however, due to the plottings of Pausanias with the Persians and their unwillingness to campaign too far from home, the Spartans withdrew into a relative isolation, leaving the rising power of Athens to lead the continued effort against the Persians. This isolationist tendency was further reinforced by the revolts of some of her allies and a great earthquake in 464, which was followed by a large-scale revolt of the Mycenaean Helots. The parallel rise of Athens as a major power in Greece led to friction with Sparta, and to two large-scale conflicts, which devastated Greece. Sparta suffered several defeats during these wars, including, for the first time, the surrender of an entire Spartan unit at Sphacteria in 425 BC, but ultimately emerged victorious, primarily through the aid it received from the Persians. Under its admiral Lysander, the Persian-funded Peloponnesian fleet captured the cities of the Athenian alliance, and of decisive naval victory at Aegospotami forced Athens to capitulate. The Athenian defeat left Sparta and its military forces in a dominant position in Greece. End of hegemony. Spartan ascendancy did not last long. By the end of the 5th century BC, Sparta had suffered serious casualties in the Peloponnesian Wars, and its conservative and narrow mentality alienated many of its former allies. At the same time, its military class, the Spartiate caste, was in decline for several reasons. Population decline due to Sparta's frequent wars in the late 5th century. Since Spartiates were required to marry late, birth rates remained low, making it difficult to replace their losses. One could be demoted from Spartiate status for a number of reasons, such as cowardice in battle or the inability to pay for membership in the Syssitia. Inability to pay became such an increasingly severe problem because commercial activity had started to develop in Sparta. Some Spartiates had to sell the land from which they drew their income. As the constitution made no provisions for promotion to Spartiate caste, numbers gradually dwindled. As Sparta's military power waned, Thebes repeatedly challenged its authority. The ensuing Corinthian War led to the humiliating Peace of Antalcidas that destroyed Sparta's reputation as the protector of the independence of Greek city-states. At the same time, Spartan military prestige suffered a severe blow when a Mora of 600 men was decimated by Peltasts under the command of the Athenian general Iphicrates. Spartan authority finally collapsed after their disastrous defeat at the Battle of Leuctra by the Thebans commanded by Epaminondas in 371 BC. The battle, in which large numbers of Spartiates were killed, resulted in the loss of the fertile Messenia region. Army organization. Social structure. The Spartan people were divided into three classes. Full citizens, known as the Spartiates proper, or homoioi, who received a grant of land for their military service. Perioretia, free non-citizens, generally merchants, craftsmen and sailors, who were used as light infantry and on auxiliary roles on campaign. The third and most numerous class were the Helots, state-owned serfs used to farm the Spartiate kleros. By the 5th century BC, the Helots too were used as light troops in skirmishes. The Spartiates were the core of the Spartan army. They participated in the assembly and provided the hoplites in the army. Indeed, they were supposed to be soldiers and nothing else, being forbidden to learn and exercise any other trade. To a large degree, the constant war footing of Spartan society was needed to keep the vastly more numerous Helots subdued. One of the major problems of later Spartan society was the steady decline in fully enfranchised citizens, which also meant a decline in available military manpower. The number of Spartiates decreased from 6,000 in 640 BC to 1,000 in 330 BC. The Spartans were therefore forced to use Helot hoplites, and occasionally they freed some of the Laconian Helots, the Neodamodes, and gave them land to settle in exchange for military service. The Spartiate population was subdivided into age groups. The youngest at 20 were counted as weaker due to lack of experience, and the oldest, up to 60 or in a crisis 65, were only called up in an emergency to defend the baggage train. Tactical structure. The principal source for the organization of the Spartan army is Xenophon, who admired the Spartans, and whose Constitution of Sparta offers a detailed overview of the Spartan state in society at the beginning of the 4th century BC. Other authors, notably Thucydides, also provide information, but it is not always as reliable as Xenophon's first-hand accounts. Little is known of the earlier organization, and much is left open to speculation. The earliest form of social and military organization seems to have been the three tribes, who appear in the Second Mycenaean War. A further subdivision was the fraternity, of which 27, or 9 per tribe, are recorded. Eventually this system was replaced by 5 territorial divisions, the Obi, which supplied Ilocos of California, 1,000 men each. This system was still used during the Persian Wars, as implied by references to the Lochoi made by Herodotus in his history. The changes that occurred between the Persian and the Peloponnesian Wars are not documented, but according to Thucydides, at Mantinea in 418 BC there were 7 Lochoi present, each subdivided into 4 Pentecostes of 128 men, which were further subdivided into 4 Enimotiae of 32 men, giving a total of 3,584 men for the main Spartan army. By the end of the Peloponnesian War, the structure had evolved further, both to address the shortages in manpower and to create a more flexible system that allowed the Spartans to send smaller detachments on campaign or to garrisons outside their homeland. According to Xenophon, the basic Spartan unit remained the Enimotia, with 36 men in 3 files of 12 under an Enimotarches. 2 Enimotiae formed a Pentecostes of 72 men under a Pentecotta, and 2 Pentecostiae were grouped into a Lochos of 144 men under a Locargos. 4 Lochoi formed a Mora of 576 men under a Polemarchos, the largest single tactical unit of the Spartan army. 6 Morai composed the Spartan army on campaign, to which were added the Sciritae and the contingents of allied states, the kings and the Hippish. The full army was nominally led in battle by the 2 kings. Initially, both went on campaign, but after the 6th century BC only one, with the other remaining at home. Unlike other states, their authority was severely circumscribed. Actual power rested with the 5 elected ephoroi. The kings were accompanied by a select group of 300 men as a royal guard, who were termed Hippish. Despite their title, they were infantry hoplites like all Spartiates. Indeed, the Spartans did not utilize a cavalry of their own until late into the Peloponnesian War, when small units of 60 cavalrymen were attached to each Mora. The Hippish belonged to the first Mora and were the elite of the Spartan army, being deployed on the honorary right side of the battle line. They were selected every year by specially commissioned officials, the Hippogratae, from among experienced men who had sons, so that their line would continue. Training. At first, in the archaic period of 700–600 BC, education for both sexes was, as in most Greek states, centered on the arts. with the male citizen population later receiving military education. However, from the 6th century onwards, the military character of the state became more pronounced, and education was totally subordinated to the needs of the military. Both boys and girls were brought up by the city women until the age of 7, when boys were taken from their mothers and grouped together in packs, and were sent to what is almost equivalent to present-day military boot camp. This military camp was known as the Agadi. They became inured to hardship, being provided with scant food and clothing. This also encouraged them to steal, and if they were caught, they were punished, not for stealing, but for being caught. There is a characteristic story, told by Plutarch. The boys make such a serious matter of their stealing, that one of them, as the story goes, who was carrying concealed under his cloak a young fox which he had stolen, suffered the animal to tear out his bowels with its teeth and claws, and died rather than have his theft detected. The boys were encouraged to compete against one another in games and mock fights and to foster an esprit de corps. In addition, they were taught to read and write and learned the songs of Chariots that celebrated Spartan exploits in the Second Mycenaean War. They learned to read and write not for cultural reasons, but so they could be able to read military maps. At the age of 12, a boy was classed as a youth. His physical education was intensified, discipline became much harsher, and the boys were loaded with extra tasks. The youths had to go barefoot, and were dressed only in a tunic both in summer and in winter. Adulthood was reached at the age of 18, and the young adult initially served as a trainer for the boys. At the same time, the most promising youths were included in the Crypteia. At 20, Spartans became eligible for military service and joined one of the messes, which included 15 men of various ages. Those who were rejected retained a lesser form of citizenship, as only the soldiers were ranked among the homoioi. Military duty lasted until the 60th year, but there are recorded cases of older people participating in campaigns in times of crisis. Throughout their adult lives, the Spartiates continued to be subject to a training regime so strict that, as Plutarch says, they were the only men in the world with whom war brought a respite in the training for war. Bravery was the ultimate virtue for the Spartans. Spartan mothers would give their sons the shield with the words, "Return with it" or "carried on it," that is to say, either victorious or dead. Since in battle, the heavy hoplite shield would be the first thing a fleeing soldier would be tempted to abandon. Ripsaspia, dropping the shield, was a synonym for desertion in the field. The army on campaign. Tactics like the armies of the other Greek states, the Spartan army was an infantry-based army that fought using the phalanx formation. The Spartans themselves did not introduce any significant changes or tactical innovations in hoplite warfare, but their constant drill and superb discipline made their phalanx much more cohesive and effective. The Spartans employed the phalanx in the classical style in a single line, uniformly deep in files of 8 to 12 men. When fighting alongside their allies, the Spartans would normally occupy the honorary right flank. If, as usually happened, the Spartans achieved victory on their side, they would then wheel left and roll up the enemy formation. During the Peloponnesian War, engagements became more fluid, light troops became increasingly used and tactics evolved to meet them. But in direct confrontations between two opposing phalanxes, stamina and pushing ability were what counted. It was only when the Thebans, under Epaminondas, increased the depth of a part of their formation at the Battle of Leuctra that the Spartan phalanx broke. On the march, according to Xenophon, the army was mobilized by the ephors, and after a series of religious ceremonies and sacrifices, the army assembled and set out. The army proceeded led by the king, with the Sciritaean cavalry detachments acting as an advance guard and scouting parties. The necessary provisions were carried along with the army, and each Spartan was accompanied by a Helot manservant. Each Mora marched and camped separately, with its own baggage train. Sacrifice was given every morning and before battle by the king and the officers. If the omens were not favorable, a pious leader might refuse to march or to engage the enemy. The only people who could have a gravestone were women who died in childbirth and warriors who died in battle. Both were considered lives given for the state.